Doug Stone, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
So you are the author of a book called Thanks for the Feedback. You previously wrote a book called Difficult Conversations, co-authored a book called Difficult Conversations. It's a great book. I've read that one as well. But what I thought was interesting, the research and writing of that book, you all uncovered that the most difficult conversation that people reported having was giving and receiving feedback. What is it about feedback that just makes it hard to give and people hate doing it?
Yeah. Well, I have this sort of weird job where, among other things, I go into organizations or communities or work with families, and one of the first questions I ask them, I'm working with them on communication, how to communicate more clearly. One of the first questions I ask them are, what are some of your hardest conversations? What are some examples? And we make a list, and pretty much without fail, they'll always put giving and receiving feedback on the list. And that applies whether it's some global corporation or just some smaller group. It seems to be a universal human challenge, getting feedback, giving feedback. And so that was, once we started realizing that was such a common pattern, we decided to really try to focus on that question.
So what I thought was interesting, the way you guys approach this, though, is that most books and articles you see about how to make feedback better focus on the giver, right? So you do the compliment sandwich. Start off with something good you like, give the feedback, and then start with end with a compliment. But you argue in the book that gets the solution to the problem backwards, and then instead we should focus on the receiver of the feedback. Why is that?
Yeah, well, the compliment sandwich, by the way, it's not a terrible idea. The idea of starting positive, then negative, then positive. But the problem is, of course, if you gave someone a sandwich that had bread, ham, and bread, they wouldn't call it a bread sandwich or a bread, ham, and bread sandwich. They'd just call it a ham sandwich because they know the thing in the middle is the important part. So the challenge with the compliment sandwich is, especially if people notice that it's a pattern, they kind of dismiss the positive stuff, and then they just take on the negative stuff, so it doesn't end up serving the purpose that maybe it should. Our angle on this was to focus on the people receiving the feedback rather than the people giving the feedback. And again, from where I sit, we were getting called in by organizations to help train their managers in how to give feedback better, which makes sense to us. So we went and we did that. And we did it a bunch. And over time, what we found is the people that we were working with would say, yeah, this is helping a little bit. People are getting better at it, but the whole system still isn't working as well as we're hoping or as well as we'd like. And we started thinking about that. And we were thinking, what else can we teach people about how to give feedback? And it suddenly dawned on us, just like stunningly obvious, that there are two people in that conversation, right? There's a feedback giver and a feedback receiver. And we're focusing all our energy on how do you get better as a feedback giver. And there's only so far you can go. You can go from not good to pretty good or pretty good to very good. But at the end of the day, the person who is deciding what that feedback means, whether to take it, is the person on the receiving end. And so we started looking at the whole question from that point of view.
Right, and that could be a hard sell to say that for the receiver to improving how they receive feedback. It's like, listen here, I got this feedback I'm going to give you, like what you're doing wrong, and here's how you can actually listen to me better.
It is a hard sell, exactly. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's a hard sell. But so let's talk about this. Like, what makes receiving feedback so difficult? So you argue in the book there's two tensions inside of us that make receiving feedback sort of hard to swallow.
Yeah, so just as human beings, we all have two driving needs. Well, we have a bunch of them, but among others, we have two. And one is we do want to learn and get better and improve. And if you ask anybody whether they want to learn and get better and improve, everybody says yes. At the same time, we want to feel like the people around us, the people we work with, the people we live with, the people we care about, accept us and love us and appreciate us the way we are now. And so we, on the one hand, we want to get better, which means we need to sort of hear feedback, take it, engage with it. And on the other hand, we are kind of stuck because we're thinking, well, what does that mean? If they're giving me all this feedback, what does that mean about me? What does that mean about whether I'm okay the way I am now? And so it's a difficult place to be. And it's not because there's something wrong with any individual person that they don't like getting feedback. I think it's pretty universal.
Right. And so you say there's 3 obstacles, or what you call triggers, that blocks us from, getting to that point where we want to get better. We listen to feedback to get better. These triggers cause us to get defensive. What are those obstacles?
Yeah. So when we studied this, we realized that there's a million reasons people don't take feedback. And you could just make a huge list and say, here's a million reasons why we get in trouble. But what, a reader or somebody who's learning about this can't really do anything with a list of a million reasons or even 50 reasons. So what we try to do is just break them down into 3 key categories, 3 kinds of triggers that we all have that can set us off. And the first is the most obvious, which is what we call the truth trigger. And this just, if I get feedback that says, you were sort of dominating that meeting, or you were talking over people, and I'm thinking that's just wrong, either because I don't think I was talking that much, or in an extreme example, maybe I wasn't at the meeting. So it's like literally actually wrong. If we get feedback that we think is wrong, we're not going to take it. And reading this book about feedback, people think, well, so if receiving feedback is a good thing and that's how you learn, does that mean I have to take all feedback, even if it's wrong? And of course, the answer is no, right? We have enough feedback that's right and useful. We don't need to be taking feedback that's actually wrong. That's going to send us in the wrong direction. So the key around the truth trigger, and we can get more into this in a bit, isn't that, well, we should just assume all feedback is helpful and right and accurate, but just that we're probably rejecting feedback before we even understand what it actually means. And that's a common pattern. A second trigger is what we call relationship triggers. And this is not so much about the substance of the feedback, right? It's not so much the content of what someone's saying, but just sort of who that person is. Who's the person giving it to me, right? So we're going to hear feedback differently if it comes from our spouse or our partner or our parent or our boss or our child or our neighbor, or someone we like, someone we don't like, someone we trust, someone we don't trust. And we tend to let the sort of who dominate the what. And in our view, it's important just to separate those out, to think about, who's giving me this feedback and what's my reaction to it. But even if I don't necessarily trust this person, is there anything that might be legitimate or useful to me in what they're saying? And then the third trigger is what we call identity triggers. And this is mostly about what does this feedback say about who I am and how I see myself. And when feedback feels, you get feedback that you're not a good parent or not a good boyfriend, or, the presentation didn't go well, it's very easy to let that sort of get out of control and just start thinking like, well, what does this mean about me, and what kind of person am I, and what do people really think about me? And we start getting so lost in that we're not really even taking in the feedback anymore.
Gotcha. So let's go into these triggers and how to overcome them in more detail. So the truth trigger, you start off in that section about breaking down the types of feedback that we get. And you say there's 3. There's appreciation feedback, coaching feedback, and evaluation feedback. Can you briefly describe what each type of feedback looks like? And then we'll talk about how those things can get mixed together and cause problems.
Yeah, exactly. So imagine your partner or roommate or spouse has been cooking meals for you in the evening, and let's say they've made meatloaf for the last 30 nights. So let's say you want to give them feedback on this meatloaf. Appreciation would say, honey, I'm so grateful to you for putting all this time in, making the meatloaf. It means a lot to me, right? So that's appreciation. We know what that is. Coaching would be offering advice on how the meatloaf can improve. So you might say, I think the meatloaf tastes better if it's fully defrosted before it's served. So you might have some little cooking tips there. And evaluation sort of ranks the person or the effort. So you might say, well, we've been having this 30 days in a row, and day 17, this feedback was in the top third of all the meatloaf that you've made. And so each of these appreciation, coaching, and evaluation have different purposes behind them. And as you say, and we can get into, they get sort of mixed up, and that's one of the things that makes feedback the toughest.
Yeah, so let's talk about how can they get mixed up, and why does that cause problem?
Yeah, so the one of the first things that happens is that appreciation just drops out. And in the workplace, I think people just feel like, well, we're busy, people are getting a paycheck, and so the negative feedback is always an emergency, right? You've got to turn this document around. You've got to get this out. Those are emergencies. It's never an emergency to pull somebody aside and say, thank you, that was a really great effort. So appreciation can easily drop out, but studies have shown that the U.S. Department of Labor did a couple studies where they found that over 90% of American workers feel underappreciated at work, which is kind of a staggering statistic. And a similar stat, they found that people who leave their jobs voluntarily, in other words, they're not fired, but they quit, cite a lack of appreciation as the number one reason. About 50% of people say lack of appreciation as the number one reason. So when appreciation drops out, it really has a potentially very negative effect on the relationship. And appreciation, I think it's, as with the feedback sandwich that we started with, we can often give appreciation that sounds like, we say, hey, great job, that's the appreciation. Then the things we want them to do differently, we say, I've got a list of 100 things that I want you to change. And then at the end we say, and by the way, great job. So the positive appreciation is incredibly general, and it's not attached to anything. The person has no reason to believe that it means anything. And then the negative things, the things that actually need some action, are very specific. And it's actually quite useful to try to offer specific appreciation, specific positive things that the person is doing well, partly because it makes them feel good, and partly also that teaches them that those are things that they should keep doing. So one of the key challenges is that appreciation drops out, and that can be rough on the relationship. The other key thing that the sort of common dynamic is that coaching and evaluation get confused, and that we often hear coaching as evaluation. And I'll give you an example. Let's just a simple example. Imagine you're driving and you have a passenger, and you can imagine whoever you want as your passenger, but the passenger just says, hey, slow down, you're driving too fast. So what is that? What's the message there? You could hear that in two ways. You could hear that as coaching, like drive a little bit slower, it's safer. There's, that's going to be a useful tip around your driving skills. Or you could hear it as evaluation, like you're a reckless person, or you're, you don't care about safety. And the person might be saying one or the other of those. But as human beings, we often tend to hear the evaluation that's given, and the coaching drops out. So the part that's going to help us actually get better at something, if somebody has actual driving tips for us that might be useful to us, we're not going to hear them if we just get into an argument about, why are you always criticizing my driving, et cetera.
So how do you separate coaching and evaluation? Like when you're having when someone's giving you feedback, like, do you stop the conversations? Like, are you trying to offer some advice, or are you evaluating me? I mean, like, do you have to be so obvious about it, or are there subtle ways to separate the two?
Yeah. So, I think in like a formal work conversation, you can separate them out just by literally raising them, saying like, is the purpose of this conversation to rate me in some way, to rank me, or is it coaching? In personal conversations, a big thing that I've been working on in my own life is just trying to change the default assumption that I have about what the person is doing. Because very often my default assumption, and I think this is true for a lot of us, is that I hear it as evaluation. I hear it as just criticism about who I am. So if they're commenting on my driving or the way I dress or my presentation, it's very easy to hear it as you're not good enough, there's something wrong with you, you're an idiot, whatever. And that's my sort of default. So so when I get feedback, if I'm giving a presentation and there's a break and someone comes up to me and says, hey, I think it would be good if we did an exercise after the break. That sounds pretty clearly like it's intended as coaching. It's intended as advice to help me do something better. But if I'm hearing it as evaluation, which is my own tendency, then I'm just going to hear it as, your presentation stinks, and we just wanted you to know that. And so now I feel bad. Plus, there's nothing I can do, right? Just like, okay, you don't think I'm good at this. That's where we're at. If I hear it as coaching, it's not a critique. It's not an evaluation. It's not a ranking. It's just an idea that I can try to take on board, or not, something that will help me learn and improve and get better, which is pretty much the whole point of the feedback in the first place.
Yeah, and I think another point you made was is when you ask for feedback, make sure you know what you're actually looking for. I think sometimes people ask for feedback from people, and when you ask someone, I want some feedback, they're thinking, oh, they want me to coach them or evaluate this. But like the asker is really wanting some appreciation. Like, hey, you did a good job. Keep going at it, and then they don't get that and they get all upset.
Yeah, exactly. I've been taking some guitar lessons recently, just trying to pick up from my sort of high school guitar skills. And, I'm a pretty rudimentary guitar player, to say the least. And I had sort of learned this one thing, and I played it for my teacher. And what I really wanted was for my teacher to say, wow, look at that. Like, you actually played something, and it almost sounded like something. And what he said instead was, okay, so here's a couple ways you could fix that or improve that. And I was just thinking, yeah, this is not meeting me where I'm at right now. So it's very easy to get those confused, and it can be rough when that happens.
I think that's some good insight for the giver of feedback. I guess when someone's starting out with something, a beginner, they probably need more appreciation, more positive evaluation to keep them going. And then as they get better, that's when you can start giving more of the coaching, right, and the fine tuning.
Yeah, exactly. I had a teaching assistant once who kept saying, give me more coaching, and I kept saying, like, okay, so next time you could do this differently and this differently, and then she would say, no, but give me more coaching, and it was sort of like she kind of wouldn't stop, and I was thinking, like, wow, I've told you everything I know, and I don't know how much more of this you can even take on board. And finally, it occurred to me she's asking for sort of advice on how to improve, but I hadn't really given much global appreciation. And I just sort of stepped back and I said, something occurs to me that I haven't said, which is, you're just really good at this. Like, if you keep doing this, you're going to be good at this. You have a lot of passion and talent for this. And she was just that was like exactly where she was at. That was what she needed to hear. And as you say, I think that's right, especially at the beginning when people are trying to get their feet under them. That kind of feedback can be just, more important than any other, than the best, most brilliant piece of advice.
So going back to this truth obstacle, one of our, I think, knee-jerk reactions when we receive feedback is trying to find out why that feedback's wrong. Like, why is this guy wrong and why am I right? And it's natural, but how can we overcome that knee-jerk reaction and actually listen to or consider the feedback with, like you said, you don't have to necessarily accept it, but at least consider it.
Yeah, exactly. So when we're taking in feedback, we're hearing it through the question in our head. The question in our head that's playing is, what's wrong with this feedback? And if that's the question that you have, there's always going to be something wrong with it, right? It's out of date. It was a month ago that happened, or it was 5 minutes ago that happened. It's not true anymore. Or you talked to the wrong people, or you didn't put the feedback quite the right way. There's always something wrong with feedback. And so if we sort of throw out feedback just based on spotting something that's wrong with it, we're always going to end up throwing out all the feedback. And it's not that we should therefore ask the question, it's not that we should just say, okay, well, if I'm not supposed to ask what's wrong, I'll just assume it's right and take all the feedback, because as we said before, that's not going to be useful. But so it's fine to ask what's wrong with it, but we also need to pair that with its sort of sister question, which is what's right about this feedback? What could I actually learn? What might be useful about this? It's sort of like if you went into a clothing store and you tried on a pair of pants and they didn't fit, and you just walked out and said, well, the clothes in the store don't fit. And, it would be pretty reasonable to say, well, you tried on one pair and they didn't fit. They've got 100 other pair of pants. And it's the same with feedback, where we think, well, if we can find one thing wrong with it, then that feedback we're just going to throw it out. But better to actually step back and say, is there anything here that might be useful to me, that might make sense to me, that might actually help me?
And I think another issue that gets to this truth trigger is that there's often a miscommunication about what's going on, what's actually happening. So there's these blind spots that exist. So like people can't read your brain, they can't read your mind. So you might have intended something, and they give you feedback that says, well, no, you're doing this. This is what your intention was, but like that wasn't your intention. You're actually trying to do this thing that they said that you weren't trying to do. So
right.
How do you close that gap between the giver and the receiver about feedback, or about the truth of feedback?
Yeah. So this whole topic of blind spots is really fascinating. I think everyone would agree that human beings have blind spots, and what they mean by that is other people have blind spots. It's very hard for us, even just conceptually, to think of ourselves as having blind spots. And by blind spots, a couple of examples are things like our facial expressions. You think about sitting in a meeting in a work setting, or in a family, sitting around a family dinner table. Everybody else in that setting can see your face. The only person who can't see your face is yourself. And so they all have this information about you, which is what your face looks like right now, which is information that you literally don't have. And you sort of imagine what you think your face looks like, or what you imagine your face is conveying, if anything. And sometimes the way you imagine is right, and sometimes your face is kind of giving off information or communication that is different, either different in the sense that it's not what you intended, or sometimes it's different in the sense that it's exactly what you're actually thinking, but didn't necessarily want to be saying. I was working with an executive a few years back, and she had just gotten a bunch of feedback that said that her team members were down on her and didn't think she was doing a good job, and found her very difficult to work with. And this was particularly disturbing because she had gotten the same feedback 3 years ago, and she was really working on it, and she was proud of herself for being easier to work with. And then lo and behold, 3 years later, feedback swings around again, and she gets the same critique. And I said, well, what do you make of this? What's causing this? Why do you think people are finding you difficult to work with? And she said, well, here's what I think. I don't think I am difficult to work with. I think it's political. Everyone likes shooting down their boss. It's just, there's other stuff going on. And then, and she assured me that she was a friendly, compassionate person. And then her cell phone rang, and she took the call as I was standing there, and I could hear her side of the conversation, obviously. And it was a colleague, a subordinate of hers, who had called to ask a question. And her response sounded essentially like this. She said, no, I'm in a meeting right now. I told you that's the kind of thing you should be finding out on your own. I told you not to bother me with these kinds of questions. Thank you. And then she hung up, and she said, see, this is the problem. The people I'm working with, they have no initiative. They keep bothering me with these questions. But as you could hear, I'm very polite. I explain things to people. So I don't know exactly what's causing the problem. And what I could hear, and what her colleague could hear, that she apparently wasn't hearing, was that her tone of voice is filled with contempt for this person and frustration, right? So the person on the other end of the phone isn't thinking, okay, so you're coaching me on how to, do things on my own, and you're saying thank you at the end, so this is all good. The person's hearing the frustration as the key message, or the contempt. You're not smart enough, you're not good enough, you don't work hard enough. And so when they evaluate her, that's what they're evaluating. And it's just a blind spot from her point of view. It's not that she's a bad person or that she's pretending. She literally didn't know that she was giving out those messages.
That's a hard problem to solve too, because like in her mind, she thought that she was genuinely trying to be more easier to get along with, easier to work with, but like that actually wasn't happening.
Exactly.
So I mean, how do you solve that problem? Like when you think, oh yeah, I am doing this thing, but you're actually not doing this thing. How do you overcome that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so it is hard. I mean, just by definition, right? These are blind spots, and if you could see them easily, they would have a different name. But the thing that I've seen work best is to begin to notice these gaps where you think you're doing something well, and you're getting feedback not just once and not just from one person, but from different sources that say, no, actually, you're not doing this well. And it's not that what we tend to do is we explain that gap by some other, we put in some explanation like it's political or they're jealous. These are very common examples. People will fill in that gap by saying, well, they're jealous of me because I'm successful or I'm good at this, etc. And so the awareness for us has to be built around sort of that starting point where we think we're one way, and we do hear the feedback that we're maybe not so easy to work with in this example. But instead of saying like I have to explain it away, just sort of sit with it and say, it's possible that people are giving me this feedback because they're jealous, or it's possible that they're giving me this feedback because there's some political thing going on. But what if it were a different reason? What if the feedback were in some way legitimate and important? How could I make sense of that? And then, a place to go is to think about what are some of the common blind spots that we all have. And the list isn't that long. It's things around, body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, and so forth. And so once you start seeing those gaps and you start sort of running through that, you can at least begin to get a sense of it. And then once you have a sense that maybe that's what's going on, you can talk to a friend or colleague and sort of urge them to tell you the truth, not just the friendly thing, but, to say, look, I think I'm getting feedback here that might be in a blind spot. So I want you to let me know if, how this looks from your perspective.
Okay. So you're asking to tell them the hard truth. Let's switch over to relationship triggers. I think we've all experienced this, right? I mean, I remember as a kid, if my parents gave me feedback on something, I'd just be like, roll my eyes and just like, oh my gosh, you guys don't know anything. But then if some coach or teacher or stranger gave me the exact same advice, I'm like, oh yeah, this person knows what they're talking about. I'm gonna follow this advice. So I think we all intuitively understand why relationships can affect how we receive feedback. One of the interesting things I thought you hit on, because I've seen this in my own life, is this idea of switch track conversations that can happen because of a relationship. So What are switch track conversations?
So in the book, we give, I think, a great example that's also a fun example. People at this point probably know the comedian Louis C.K., and he's a stand-up comic, and he currently has a show called Louis on cable. But before that show, he had a prior show called Lucky Louie, and there's a scene so in that show, he's married to his wife, obviously, and he's about to have a romantic weekend with her, and he brings her red roses as a gift. And the first thing out of her mouth is, I don't like red roses, remember? And then the next thing out of his mouth is, whether you like red roses or not, a polite person says, thank you for the roses. And then you can comment on whether you like them or not. And then she says, why would I thank you for something that I don't want? And they sort of go back and forth like this. And when I was watching it, I was thinking, this is it's like a marital argument, and it feels very real and typical. And then it suddenly occurred to me that what was going on was this dynamic of what in the book we call switch tracking, where these two people are almost in two different conversations. Like it sounds like they're talking about the roses, and they're both talking about the roses. So you think, well, maybe they're talking about the same thing. But in fact, the wife is saying, you don't listen to me. I've told you before that I don't like red roses. You don't listen to me. and the husband is saying, you don't appreciate me. I try to do nice things for you and you don't appreciate me. Those are just two different conversations. You can't have those at the same time, sort of in a back and forth. You actually have to separate out those two topics and have each of them separately. And they're not easy conversations to have separately either, but there's at least some chance that the husband, or Louis in this case, could say, so it sounds like you think I don't listen to you. Tell me more about that. Let's talk about that. And then he could swing around and say, so the other thing that's going on here is I feel like you don't appreciate the efforts that I make. And then they could talk about that. And there, you at least have a chance to get through both these conversations in a useful way. But once you start noticing that dynamic of switch tracking, it's unbelievable how common it is in our lives where we get or give feedback. Let's say we get feedback, and instead of responding to the content of the feedback, we respond to how it's delivered or who's giving it to us or what time. How could you send that bad news by email? How could you send it on, Friday at 5:00? Not that those may be legitimate conversations to have, but they're additional to whatever the actual underlying feedback was about.
Yeah, and I think it's mainly like a defense mechanism, because I know I do that, right? When my wife will bring something up, I'll say, well, you really could have said that differently. Like, I just completely ignore the feedback. I'm just trying to
right.
Trying to protect my ego by throwing, hey, you're not so great either because you do this thing.
Exactly. I think that's right. It's partly a defense mechanism, but it's partly just it's a real thing. In other words, if you feel like you're either getting too much criticism or you're not appreciated for what you do well, when someone criticizes you, the thing that's in your head is, well, wait a second, what about all the times where I didn't do that? And so you're trying to defend yourself, but you're trying to defend yourself not to, get out of looking at the truth. You're trying to defend yourself because you feel like this is a legitimate, important topic, and it is. The challenge is just that it needs to be a separate conversation. If you comment on the house is not neat or whatever, and the person storms out of the room, what is it that's triggering them? Let's talk about that. And let's also talk about sort of what are the rules about how we keep the house clean.
So how does the dynamic of a relationship affect whether you get into these switch track conversations? I mean, is it if there's like a lot of tension, you're more likely to move to these switch track conversations, or if there's less tension, you're less likely to do it?
Yeah, I think if there's more tension, we're more likely, but I think we all actually fall into them pretty commonly. That just think how common it is to say things like, I can't believe they told me that, at 5 on Friday, or I don't like that, I can't believe they broke up with me on the telephone. That kind of thing. We're just very sensitive, and I think rightly so, to sort of the way feedback is delivered and the timing of it, and the does the person appreciate us or not? So it comes up constantly. And again, the answer isn't to pretend that you don't have your own concerns. For example, with Louis and the flowers, the answer is not for him to say, okay, I'll start listening to you from now on, and now we're done. The answer is for him to talk about her topic, which is listening, but then for him separately to talk about his topic, which is appreciation.
All right, so be aware of it. So what can we do to mitigate relationship triggers when we're giving and receiving feedback, right? I mean, like I said in that earlier example, like your parents or your wife could give you a set of advice, but you just ignore it because they're your parents and your wife. But if some complete stranger gives you advice, you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to listen. That's actually a good point. So how do you overcome that bias of just totally disregarding advice if it comes from someone close to you, even though it might be useful?
A few things. I mean, I think the first thing is just to be aware of that, right? To notice when you're in a pattern where your wife or a relationship or somebody is giving you feedback over and over again, and you've kind of stopped hearing it because it's your parent or a spouse or whatever. And just to ask yourself, okay, so what's going on here? I'm not taking this feedback because they're annoying me, or because this is, it's my parent being critical or whatever. And to if you choose to try to make that discussable, to say, like in a marriage, to say, look, every day you spend the day criticizing me for not taking out the garbage, the 100 things that I'm doing wrong. Let's see if we can figure this out so we don't have to keep having the same conversation. Just making it explicit. And if it, at the same time, when we're sort of beaten down by too much feedback from the same person, it's fine to say, and probably useful to say, this feedback's not helpful anymore. There's nothing new in this feedback for me. I'm trying to change, or here's the limits of what I can do. But you just giving me this feedback over and over again isn't doing anything for me in terms of actually fixing the problem.
So you argue in the book that the way we receive feedback and handle it can often be determined by our wiring and temperament. How so?
Yeah, so there's this in psychology, some people subscribe to what they call the 50-40-10 rule. And I don't know about the exact percentages, but the idea of it is that about 50% of how we react in the world to feedback or to bad news or to setbacks is just based on our wiring, our constitution, our sort of neurology. And 10%, the 50-40-10, so 50 is wiring, 10% is based on the actual situation that's going on around us. So we're getting the bad news, we didn't get the pay raise or whatever it was. And that leaves this 40%, and the 40% of how we react in any given situation isn't based on our wiring, and it's not based on the actual situation. And so you say, well, what's left? What could it be based on? And what it's based on is the way we're interpreting what the news is, the story that we're telling about it. And so, if you don't get a pay raise, you might say, well, there's no story to tell. I just don't get a pay raise. So what's the story? How do I tell a different story? I can't pretend that that I'm getting more pay. But what happens is if we find out that we're not getting a pay raise, we might start doing these kind of snowballing, catastrophic thinking like, I'm never going to get a pay raise, or I'm never going to do a good job, or I'm going to get fired soon. And then it can even work backwards, where we start looking to the past and say, I've never done anything right in my life, and I can't do anything right now. And I know this is about work, but I'm also not a good husband. I'm not a good father. And before you know it, it's just completely out of control. And so the sort of advice is not to pretend that you're, getting an increase in salary, or to deny that you didn't get a pay raise, but to simply keep it the size that it is, to acknowledge this is what this is what this means. But also, it's not about the past. It's not about, have I ever done anything well in my life? It's not about the future in the sense that this means nothing good is ever going to happen to me again. So when we sort of supersize the feedback, it gets out of control. And that's where that 40% of how we react can come in. Is some people will sort of exaggerate things into the future and into the past, and other people are very good at sort of keeping it the size that it is. And some people are actually go in the other extreme, which is they don't take in the feedback at all, which is sort of a form of narcissism, which is not good either. So you want to be hearing the feedback, but keeping it the size it is, and keeping it meaning what it actually means, and not a whole lot more.
Right. So this idea of keeping things in proportion, this goes to, the identity trigger, right? Whenever we receive feedback,
Exactly.
It's like, boy, because I didn't get a pay raise, it means I'm a terrible employee. Because I'm a terrible employee, I'm a terrible husband, yada, yada.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, if you actually got genuine feedback that all these terrible things were true about your past, about your present, about your future, you would be pretty depressed and unhappy, and you would spiral out of control. But the point is that in most of these kinds of situations, you're getting a very discrete piece of feedback, and then we're telling an exaggeratedly negative story about it. And that's just shooting ourselves in the foot.
And you talk about, in order to avoid this identity trigger, you need to switch from a static mindset or to a growth mindset. It's Carol Dwecks, I call it. We've had her on the podcast before to talk about this.
Oh, great. Yeah, so her work has been really interesting. Yeah, she talks about a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. Yeah. And in the fixed mindset, people think to themselves, I have a certain set of skills, like I'm a certain amount of smart, I'm a certain amount of athletic, I have a certain amount of perseverance. And so that's fixed. And so the only thing that feedback does for me is it tells me what that amount is. So if I take a test in school, I'm finding out, am I smart or am I stupid? So when you go in and take a test on, the Civil War or whatever the topic is, and you think that the feedback you're getting on the test is you're smart or you're stupid, and you find out, either way, if you find out you're smart, now you're thinking, okay, I'm smart, but that puts pressure on me to keep being smart. If you find out you're stupid, you feel like, well, that's too bad. There's nothing I can do. I guess I'm one of those people who's destined not to do well. And Dweck says, but why are we hearing it that way? We can just as easily think that these endowments that we have, whether about intelligence or athletic ability or empathy or whatever the skill is, these are things that we can get better at, right? And it's absolutely true that you can get better at virtually everything in your life. It's not to say everyone's going to be LeBron James in basketball or Yo-Yo Ma, as a cellist. But, we can all get better, and sometimes we can get a little better. Sometimes we can get a lot better. Some even people that are really, really bad at math can get better at math. And there is no reason to think of that as just this fixed thing. And once you start thinking about it that way, then you get your test score back on the Civil War. And instead of thinking, I got a bad grade, that means I'm stupid. The information in this conversation is that I'm stupid. The information in this conversation is you don't know much about the Civil War, and the coaching is so study differently, study harder, study more efficiently, play fewer computer games, whatever. Those are all things that you have power to influence, right? So you're not just stuck with a label. You can actually change it, and that gives you a lot of freedom to improve. But it also clears away some of the high stakes that we associate with all these measures along the way of our lives.
Yeah, I think this understanding the fixed and growth mindset and focusing on growth mindset is really useful for that evaluative feedback, or feedback you interpret as evaluative, right? Someone tells you like, well, you're not that good, and you can interpret if you have a fixed mindset, well, I'll never be good. But if you have a growth mindset, well, okay, I'm not good now, but I can get better.
Right, exactly. And that very naturally takes you do hear the evaluation, I'm not that good right now. And again, you're not pretending that that's not true. You're not pretending that you're the Civil War genius or whatever. But it also then, so you're hearing the evaluation, but then it quickly moves into coaching, which is, okay, if this is a thing that I can be better and worse at, and they're telling me I'm not good at it now, then the coaching is I gotta start doing things differently, and that gives you some power over the situation.
So let's talk about rejecting feedback, because as you said, just because someone gives you feedback doesn't necessarily, you should consider it, but not necessarily take it into account or actually apply it what they give you. 'Cause sometimes people are wrong. Sometimes you're not even looking for feedback. But rejecting feedback can be a minefield, because if it's your wife and you're saying, I'm not really looking, they can get offended, or your mom, like, why don't you listen to me? So how do you reject feedback tactfully?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And as you suggest, the context matters, right? If it's your supervisor saying you didn't hit your sales targets for this month, and you say, well, that's not where I'm at right now. I'm not going to be working on that feedback. That might not go over so well. But there's lots of times in our lives for any number of reasons. And it can be because you really disagree with the feedback, or you think the feedback's good for the person who's giving it to you, but not good for you. or it can just be, that's not where you're at right now. You're working on 5 other things. You can't take on one more thing. There's lots of reasons. There's lots of good reasons to set feedback aside. And I think the mistake that we make sometimes is we don't discuss that. We sort of hear the feedback, and in our minds we're thinking, I would never take this feedback, or I can't possibly think about this right now. But then we just kind of leave it, and then the other person sees that we're not doing anything, and so they come back and they think like, well, maybe they're not persuaded yet, or maybe they didn't hear it, and so they say it again, and then they say it again, and then they say it again. And I think the better course is to actually say, you know what, here's what I'm hearing you suggesting to me, and here's what I think of that. Either it does or it doesn't make sense, and here's why right now, or maybe forever, why I'm not going to pursue that. And the person can agree or disagree. Very often, once you explain it, they'll say like, okay, I get that. But they can agree or disagree, but at least they know that you've heard the feedback, you've understood it, and it takes away that urge they have to just keep saying it over and over and over again. Another thing that I think can be useful is just to be very pointed about saying, tell me what the purpose from your point of view is of giving me this feedback. And then the person says, well, I want you to get better. And then if you can then tie it back and say, this feedback doesn't actually help me get better, and here's why. So I had a colleague once who, right before I'd go up and give a talk, he would give me couple little things to remember, and he would do it over and over again. And from his point of view, he's just being as helpful as he possibly can. He's thinking like, well, these are the things Doug's probably going to forget, so I just got to make sure he remembers those. And I started kind of saying like, don't give me advice right before I start talking. And he kept doing it. And he's thinking, but it's good advice, which maybe it is. And so then I did this move where I said, help me understand what your goal is. When you're giving me this advice, what's the goal? And he said, well, I just want to increase the chance that you're going to, do this or remember to say this in your talk. And I said, okay, so it doesn't have that effect. It actually, to some extent, has the opposite effect, because what it does is it distracts me, makes me more nervous, and then I do worse. And, once he heard that, he at least is sort of understanding the conversation from my point of view, and can back up and say, okay, so what would be a way that would be helpful that I could, remind you about this? And, the answer may be, tell me the night before, or let's talk about it after, and then I'll do it the next time, that sort of thing. But I think too often we just aren't clear about the actual impact on it.
I think that learning how to, consider and reject feedback is particularly important in the internet, right? You can post something on Facebook and, you're not looking for feedback. You're just kind of sharing something or whatever. And then like the cousin of your cousin chimes in with just some, with their opinion on it. It's like, you need to do this, or blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, oh,
right.
And for a lot of people that can just like weigh on them, right? Just like receiving constant feedback via likes or comments on Facebook, Instagram, whatever. So how do you manage online feedback?
Yeah. Well, I think we're all subject to this, is that the negative feedback stings much more than the positive feedback makes us happy, right? So, if you get 100 comments and 99 of them are positive and one is negative, obviously the one you're going to remember, the one that's going to stay with you, is the negative one. So just for starters, it's good to be aware of that it's a common human reaction, is that I think it has to do with sort of our evolution, that we're very sensitive to possible danger in the environment, and good things are good, and we want to pursue them, but danger is sort of urgent and an emergency. So when we see something, when we get that negative post, we're sort of wired to really focus on it. But with online stuff, my own reaction, so one way that I get online feedback is the comments on Amazon about our books. And like most of the comments on Amazon, they're mostly very positive, which is sweet and nice. But occasionally someone will have a negative comment, and my absolute first reaction is always something critical of that person in a sort of irrational, crazy way. So someone will say something like, "This book is too long," or "This book is too hard," or I don't know what. My reaction is, that person's a jerk, or that person doesn't know how to read a book, or I don't have any information about this person. It could be Mother Teresa for all I know, but the first reaction I have is going to be negative, dismissive, and angry, because that's kind of what's going on with me physiologically, which is fine. But then I step back and I just try to see the situation more rationally and think, okay, there's X number of people are reading the book, X number of people are going to comment on the book. When they comment on it, some of them are going to have good reasons for not liking the book. Some of them are just going to be people that think it's fun to put up crazy comments. So sort of trying to to remind ourselves what's really going on when people are posting some of those nastier comments. They may it's really, especially on the internet, I think it's rarely about the thing that's being commented on, and it's mostly about the person doing the commenting and what kind of mood they're in, what they're trying to get off their chest, et cetera. Right. But it's hard. We're all human beings trying to make it through. And when we see those kinds of negative feedback, even if we're thinking, oh, that's some, drunk, angry guy at 3 a.m. in the morning who just wanted to get some aggression out, there's another part of us that's thinking, yeah, but maybe they're right. Maybe this book sucks or whatever.
Yeah. I've had the drunk, angry guy leave emails at 3 o'clock in the morning, go on this tirade about why I'm wrong and why my site sucks or whatever. And I'll say, hey, I thanks for reaching out, but you could have given that feedback a little more tactfully. And without fail, they always say, oh, I'm really sorry. I had a bad day yesterday. I got a little
exactly.
And I shouldn't have done that. It's really funny how that happens. Well, hey, Doug, this has been a great conversation. Where can people learn more about your book and your work?
The book's available on all the sites, Amazon and Barnes & Noble, et cetera. And my website, my company is called Triad, TRIAD Consulting Group, and the website is just that, all in one word, triadconsultinggroup.com, and that leads you to anything you could ever possibly need to know.
Excellent. Well, Doug Stone, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
It's my pleasure to be here.
My guest today was Doug Stone. He's the author of the book, Thanks for the Feedback. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can also check out his site, stoneandheen.com, for more information about the book. Also, check out the show notes at aom.is/feedback for links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.